Buenas tardes, Massachusetts. Tijuana in the house. Thanks for having me, and thank you, Leo. I'm so happy to be here, back in Massachusetts. So I'm here to tell you a little bit about the book and about myself, and I'm sure we'll have some time for question and answers. If you want to ask me stuff, you'll find I will talk about almost anything. So usually, I spend my life on the road now. I've been on the road pretty much since 2005, which has been a real blessing and a curse. I was just in D.C., and then I came here. I'm leaving for San Diego on Friday, and so on. Just keep touring. And a lot of times, I find myself having to answer burning questions about the border. People want to know about the border. And the number one question, which I will answer for you now so we can get started, is why do you look Irish? So I'm going to start with that. My family comes from Sinaloa, which is Chapo Guzman territory, birthplace of the narco wars. And we're from a small town called Rosario, Sinaloa, which is actually the model for Tres Camarones, which we'll come back to in a second. And my family moved up to Tijuana for various convoluted reasons, which is where I was born. But back in Rosario, the Urrea clan was led by the matriarch, which was my grandmother, Mama Lupita. And this may explain everything to you. Her name, her full name, was Guadalupe Murray. Red-haired, blue-eyed, Irish, Mexican lass. And my grandfather, Juan Urrea, was Basque. And the Basques, of course, from the north of Spain, between France and Spain. And doing research on a previous book, The Hummingbird's Daughter, about our family, some of our family history, I found out that the Urrea clan got the coloration from Visigoth ancestors. That's right. I'm a Visigoth, I'll own it. So he was very tall and blue-eyed, and Urrea in the Basque language means man of gold, or the golden man, Babalukin in other words. And he got to Sinaloa. They were conquerors who came during the conquest, and the Urrea brothers settled the city of Culiacan in Sinaloa. So we have a long history there. And he and Mama Lupita fell in love and created this genetic error, which is the Urrea clan. But my mom was from New York City, and she was actually a society lady. Her mother had an antique shop in Manhattan. One of the clients was Albert Einstein, and another client was John Steinbeck. I feel like I was touched by the writing fairy before I was even born. The nice thing about Steinbeck, which always warms my heart, is that he never allowed them to identify him. They could call him John, but don't ever say Steinbeck, or I can't come back. He's very humble, and I've always liked that. The family was actually, they came over like almost everybody, but they came over and settled in Virginia. They were plantation owners, lost everything in the Civil War. And many of them headed north and went to Washington, D.C., and then upward into New York, and then upper Long Island. My mother had gone to World War II. She was a donut dolly, if you know about the donut dollies, making coffee in combat. She was actually in the Battle of the Bulge, helped liberate Buchenwald, and was almost killed, and came home and couldn't re-enter New York society, so she went to San Francisco with some of her truck mates from the Red Cross. And she became a jewelry buyer for the I. Magnin department store, which was quite an operation in those days in the Bay Area. And if you knew my mother, I didn't really understand my mother, I have to say, being a Tijuana boy and then a sort of a ghetto child. I didn't know who she was. I couldn't comprehend her until I started touring. And I went to the Southern League Book Festival in Richmond, Virginia. And I suddenly realized who my mother was. She wasn't even a New Yorker. She was a sort of a 1916 edition of a late Victorian Virginian lady. And I can tell you she was the only woman in the barrio with little white gloves. And she wore a charm bracelet that rattled with every place she'd ever been. And she always wore a simple black dress with one string of pearls and a little pin, a little arty pin, sometimes a little hat, sometimes a little string veil. And she'd move her hand as she spoke. It was always up in the air as though it were a butterfly, you know. And she also thought she was posing in Vogue magazine. So she would always strike this pose, which I can reenact because I'm a brilliant mimic. But she would do this. She would put one hand on her hip. And she would talk like that. And she liked to smoke for effect, like Betty Davis, you know. And so she'd stand with a cigarette. And if you said something amusing, she would take a puff and she'd say, "Oh, darling." So I went to this book festival and I looked out and there were 1,200 of my mother. They were all, oh. And my mother never called me Luis, she called me Louis because she didn't speak Spanish. Dear boy, and Louis. And I was ordered to never say yeah. One did not say yeah. And I was expected to say mother dear, which led to street beatings in the hood. My father, on the other hand, was a poor boy from Sinaloa. He had been a silver miner starting at the age of 12. He helped amputate a man's legs at the age of 13 in a cave-in. He didn't own shoes until he was 15. And like many boys with no future, he joined the military to get, a leg up. Of course, you have to in Mexico, but his plan was to be in the military and make a career of it. And after World War II, when the Mexican government had shown sympathies to the Axis powers, they realized they had kind of backed the wrong horse, and they were moving toward snuggling back up to the United States. And so they started to promote all of the soldiers who looked North American, because they figure if we're going to send people to the United States, let's send blue-eyed blonde guys as best we can to lessen the blow at that time. So he was sent to Mexico City, or he was made a lieutenant, and he was put on night staff in the presidential palace. Now, my father was a keyboard player. He was a good pianist, and it was easy for him to learn to type because he had finger skills. So he was one of the only guys who could type in his cohort. And he had night duty in the palace, and he would type letters and so forth in his little kiosk. Now, my father, you must understand, was a very traditional Mexican man from that era, which means that he was a Lothario. My dad was a playboy. And I think what he was doing was typing love letters. In fact, I think he was doing it with carbon paper and making triplicates. Seriously. "Oh, my darling, you're so beautiful." And then he could sign it to everybody. And he was in there one night, late, typing away. And unbeknownst to him, the president of Mexico was standing behind him. And he looked up and was like, "Oh, my," and he stood up at attention, and he said, "Can you type?" And he said, "Yes, sir." "Good, I need a letter, type it for me." And they became friends. And that's how, using the Urrea charm, my dad weaseled his way into the actual presidential staff of Mexico. And they started sending him to the United States. And he was flown with a group of generals and politicians to San Francisco. And the consulate in San Francisco was going to throw them a huge party. But now you must understand, and some of you do, the late 40s, a lot different than today. And so the consulate called I. Magnon's department store and said, "We need beautiful American women to drink wine with the generals." And the manager went and saw the jewelry buyers and said, "Ladies, we're going to see the Mexicans." And they carted all these women with their jewelry to the ambassador's residence. And that's how my mother met my father, who looked a little bit like Errol Flynn and was a dancing fool. And he romanced my mom. And it began a long-distance romance that ended up in their being married. And then here I came. My mother, I believe, thought She was going to be whisked off to a lovely hacienda in old Mexico, with charros and festive mariachis and probably Anthony Quinn and Gilbert Roland hanging out, and all that. And my father left the Mexican military and joined my grandparents who had moved to Tijuana, and suddenly found herself on a dirt street in Tijuana, being the first and only American in the family. And everybody there resented her. They didn't know what had happened. Their code for her was, Alberto went and bought himself a Cadillac. Mom had a hard time. And I was born on the road to the dog track one night, and here I am. I spent my first 3.5, 4 years there in the barrio. It was called Colonia Independencia. And the Colonia was in some ways a Mexican John Irving story. You'll understand in a second. It was a dirt street on the side of a hill. At the end of the street, some eccentric retired Mexican officer built a castle. It was up on a hill. It had turrets with little guns, like you shoot your arrows for like a Monty Python movie. And he painted it bright yellow, which was very Mexican. And halfway down the road at the bottom of the hill was a family with a bear. How could I not like John Irving, right? And the bear was tied to a tree. It was some sort of performing bear. And my cousin Hugo, who's somebody you should know about because Hugo is the model for Atomico in the novel. Hugo and Toshiro Mifune in the Seven Samurai are the model for Atomico. And Hugo loved that bear. And what you need to know about Hugo partially is that he was the family pistolero. He was the gunman, super macho. And Hugo talked like this. He still talks like this. And he talked like this when he was 7. And he would say, he used to call me Lucci. That was his nickname for me, which I hated because it wasn't macho, Lucci. And he'd say, Lucci, you want to go feed the bear? I'd say, yeah. And we would take stale tortillas. And he had got the bear, he would wave the tortilla, and the bear would sit up and wave at him. And then we'd sail them like Frisbees. It was magic. It was a magical place. Unfortunately, it was a place of rough sorrow as well, and poverty. And tuberculosis swept the colonia, and I ended up on my deathbed at an early age. I had scarlatina, German measles, and tuberculosis all at the same time. And this was, for a blue blood from Manhattan, a hard thing for my mother to stomach. She was already ashamed because she had realized that she had made a terrible mistake and that she was living in what she considered filth and squalor, and her boy was dying of a disease that she was ashamed of. There was nothing she could do about it. And she prevailed on my father that we had to leave Mexico and come to the United States. My father had a green card. And so that's how I came to San Diego. We couldn't afford to live anywhere nice, so we moved into a sort of rough and tumble neighborhood, which has since been gentrified, by the way. But if you know the poet laureate of the United States, Juan Felipe Herrera, he was from the same barrio that I grew up in. We were at the opposite ends of National Avenue. He was up with the Mexicans, and I was up in what was called Logan Heights, which was a mixed neighborhood, and it was a neighborhood of race war, basically. I had spoken Spanish before I spoke English, so I came out of Tijuana with a Tijuana accent. I was telling the girls this morning, that's how I grew up talking, and I have half brothers and sisters talk like this still today, okay? That's how I talked. And in a neighborhood where brown fought black, fought white, and any of those three combinations on site, you can imagine what a challenge I was. Irish-looking dude talking Tijuana. And I like to say I felt like I was a sort of a one-man civil rights movement, because no matter who they were, they would join in brotherhood and say, shall we kick his ass today? Yes, let's. And I would flee to our stupid little apartment and read Mark Twain. So I can thank that maybe for being a writer. I don't know. My family was divided. I write about the border because the border went right down the middle of our apartment. My parents' marriage fell apart immediately. She became more American. He became more Mexican. She raised me to be an American. Louis Woodward. She never learned Spanish. My father raised me to be Luis Urrea. She spoke to me in English. He spoke to me in Spanish. The kitchen was the United States. The living room was Mexico. And that was the war. And there was an unending culture war in our household. And I was raised twice at the same time. I was expected to be an American who spoke really good English. My mother, to her dying day, was terrified that one day I would say, I ain't got none. If I ever said something like ain't, she would have had a stroke. And my father patrolled the borders of my language to hear any Americanism whatsoever. Spanglish, no way, you couldn't use it. You had to speak Spanish. And my mother was winning the war with literature. She used to read me stories at night. She began with Dickens. Dickens was the first author I ever heard. I didn't understand a word of it. And I also didn't understand the alchemy that was happening with my mom, because as soon as she'd start reading Dickens, she thought she was from London, you know? And she would suddenly break into this accent. And, you know, the Artful Dodger walked in the room and they looked at him strangely. And I'd think, wow, what's up with Mom? And then she switched to Mark Twain, which was the transformation. And from that, Rudyard Kipling. I was hooked. And my dad was trying really hard to find, you know, Mexican literature in Spanish. And in those days, as in these days, Tijuana is not the first place you go to look for a bookstore. They're just not bookstores. And he looked and he looked and he finally found his solution. He found a Spanish translation of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And he was so proud of himself. And he came home and he was given to these broad Latino gestures, and he slammed the book down on the kitchen table and he said, Luis, study this in the original Spanish. And I already knew, even in fourth grade, that it was Greek, but I didn't say anything. And we moved on to the suburbs, a nice little white working class suburb where we were the first mixed family. And I was called Greaser for the first time in my life. And I suddenly found out that people didn't like us very much, something that has never gone away, was really made sharp during the election for me and the kids I talked to. I was called Greaser, Wetback, Beaner. In California, they have one for us, which is Taco Bender. Ooh, it's creative because there's a little bend in the taco. And I had a cousin from Mexico, probably the most sacred person in my life on a certain level, Jaime. And he didn't speak much English. And we were walking down the street, and somebody pulled up in a car in that neighborhood and yelled, "Go back where you came from, Taco Bender!" And he said, "What do you want, cheeseburger?" That was his only English. So, anyway, I was a Boy Scout, and I was a music fiend. And my house was a sad place. Both of my parents were riven with nightmares. They slept in separate bedrooms. They both had really horrible military experiences. And so it was a house of a lot of crying out at night and teeth grinding and misery. And I was an insomniac, trained to be an insomniac. So I'd sit up all night with Leonard Cohen. Leonard was my best friend, you know, and he was illuminating things I could not have imagined, uses of language. And I was reading Ray Bradbury like a fiend, you know, and listening to Bob Dylan. And I was just going crazy with words. And I wanted to do that. And I did not think that a person like me would ever publish books. I thought authors were some awesome creature from some realm that I couldn't enter. But I couldn't stop myself, you know. And this beautiful thing, which I thought you'd appreciate, I went to a bookstore. I used to use my little money for doing chores, like mowing the lawn and stuff, to buy books. They were cheap back then, if you'll recall. You know, what they call a trade paperback now was like $2.50. And I was buying poetry. And I was standing in the poetry section, and I saw Jim Morrison of The Doors had a book of poems. And I had this idiot's epiphany. Dude, he typed. I thought you just put on leather pants and woo, you know. It was like this revelation to me. And so I started writing everything down. And then my mom got out her typewriter and I started typing. And this is what my mother did. One day while I was at junior high, I came walking home, unhappy as I did every day, and she was waiting for me. And she said, "Dear boy, there's a little surprise for you in the kitchen." And I thought, oh, wow, maybe she got me a record or, like a James Bond plastic pistol or something. And I went out there, and she had taken my stack of typing and sewn it together and put a cover on it. It made my first book. I was hooked from that moment forward. And then when I found cheap record books at the drugstore, and I thought, wait, somebody published an empty book? This is brilliant. I'm going to fill it. And that's all I had all through the end of junior high school and high school was my little notebook. So I was the poetry guy. And I didn't know I was doing homework, right? So long story short, I was the first member of my family to go to college. And I just told this story to the girls at the care center, but my dad wanted to give me a gift, graduation gift, because he'd never had a kid in college. He had a bunch of kids, but I was the only one of that marriage. And he drove to his hometown in Mexico to get money for me. And on his way home, he was caught by crooked cops in Mexico, and they killed him. And they didn't get the money because the wounds made him wet himself. And they didn't reach in his pocket. But a doctor did, and he hid the money from the cops. And I ended up with my graduation gift, which was $1,000 still soaked in his urine. And the police made me buy his corpse. They charged me $750 to buy the corpse. So I spent my graduation gift to buy my dad, and the rest of it, we buried him in Tijuana in an unmarked grave because we didn't have anything. So, I have I think a realistic view of the border. People ask me, why is the book so funny? And I say, because people are funny as hell. Everybody's funny. Everybody has a funny story. And I also feel, one thing I tell my writing students is that humor is the virus that infects you with humanity. Once you've sat and laughed with someone and shared some of your sorrows in laughter, it's hard to dislike them. It's hard to get up from the table and say, those people are pigs, right? And because of this NEA thing, I travel everywhere, and I talk to every imaginable political group, ethnic group, and we all get along beautifully, even if we don't agree. And I think my lesson has been that Americans kind of miss each other at this point. And people are really trying to figure out how to be family again. And sometimes it's a hard-learned lesson. I learned it in Yakima, of all places, when I was visiting apple growers who are really concerned about illegal immigration, except for these guys who work for us. These guys are good. And I was like, yeah, they're awesome because they're making you $6 million a year. You see their value. But they invited me to one of their homes, and they were lovely guys, smoking cigars. I don't smoke, so I was like, oh, that's great, yeah, thanks. And they're whiskey guys, and I don't really drink. And we had, 6 whiskeys. Taste this one, you taste the peat and smell the smoke. I was like, okay, And one of the guys said to me, so why do you call yourself a liberal? Seriously, what do you guys believe? I said, I don't know anymore, man. I said, I just want to be left alone, let my family grow up in peace. And, and they said, that's a conservative message, my friend. I said, okay. And so I said to the guys, look, I said, President Obama, I said, you know how we all grew up? And I grew up in a really tormented neighborhood of ethnic and racial war. And I said, President Obama, man, when he had his inauguration, I cried. And one of the farmers just said to me, we cried too, buddy. And we all burst out laughing. And I thought, wow, how cool is this, that we can laugh. And I had to do a book about the U.S. Border Patrol, and believe me, that was an interesting thing, trying to find my way in there. So I've tried to learn that if you're going to be a witness or present yourself as a witness, you have to witness everybody and try to give everybody as fair shake as you possibly can. And that's what I'm still trying to do. Now, this book grew out of that Border Patrol book and The Hummingbird's Daughter and some other books. I had spent 26 years on The Hummingbird's Daughter epic. And I had to investigate this horrible death event with the U.S. Border Patrol. It was really hard stuff. And when I sat down to write Beautiful North, I wanted to laugh. Like Leo said, I wanted to laugh every day. You don't always know if what you're writing is going to be published or not. I didn't know if it'd be published, but I knew I wanted to write a book that made me happy. And I sat down, and you sit around and have coffee and think, and I started kicking around these ideas, and I thought, I sure would love to write about Rosario, because to me it was Macondo. If you knew, being a ghetto child, every summer or so, every other summer, my dad would take me those 27 hours to this place that was magic. Magic. Floods, 6-foot iguanas, fresh mangoes, roosters everywhere, donkeys everywhere. The people say goodbye instead of hello. It's in the book. Adios. It was so hot, my uncle would set the only color TV in town, because he was the rich man, in the window, and we'd sit outside in the street in chairs watching TV. And when a car would come, it would flash its lights, and we'd all get up and move our chairs back, and it would drive through, and everybody would yell, Adios! It was like a Fellini movie, And so the movie theater in the book is my uncle's movie theater, El Cine Pedro Infante. And can you imagine being a poor boy, going down there, and I could see a movie free a couple times a night, every night of the week, and they changed the movies every few days. And then I started working for my uncle, so part of my job was driving with my cousin to Mazatlan to get the big movie reels and bring them back. So we'd find out while driving what the movies were. They were always double features, and I was telling people yesterday, they didn't make sense. It was like Godzilla and Love Story, right? 2001 and the Green Berets, these really weird double features. And then my uncle got this crazy idea that I could work for him announcing the movies. And if you know Mexico or Latin America at all, you know how much we love loudspeakers. We think that's great. And he had an LTD, and they would tie speakers on the roof. And Jaime would drive, and me with my squeaky little voice would announce the movies with full reverb, Este domingo, en el Cine Pedro Infante, la película más increíble del mundo, Godzilla, Rey de los Monstruos, con A Love Story. So that's where the idea came from. And I thought about that. At the same time, people always send me border-related stuff. And at that moment, it's different now, but at that moment, at the beginning of the really heinous narco stuff, when I was starting to work on the book, there were so many towns, especially in the north of Mexico, where the men had all left. So there were boys and retirement age and beyond gentlemen. But all the sort of able-bodied men from their mid-teens up had left these towns, and it was all women. And the women were discovering feminism on their own for the first time. They didn't call it feminism, but somebody had to run things. So they were getting their first woman mayor, first woman police chief, first woman director of a school, first woman principal, first woman projectionist in the movie theater. And I thought about this, and I thought, wow, so if Rosario, which I fictionalized immediately in the Tres Camarones, were devoid of men, and some bad guys had come to town, and they needed a woman mayor, who would I make mayor? Who can I imagine? And it suddenly hit me. Aunt Irma, in the book, is my Aunt Irma. Irma Urrea, Mexico's first international bowling champion. Seriously. Yeah. From Rosario. Used to live in Tijuana with us. The meanest person I ever knew in my life. Meaner than the U.S. Border Patrol. And she bowled all over the world. And she was fascinating for so many reasons. There's a scene in the book where Nayeli's mother says, I'm not feeling well, and Irma says, you've been dying for 15 years, why don't you get it over with? That was Aunt Irma dealing with my dear mother. Word for word. And Aunt Irma, I had another aunt, Tia Flaca, Aunt Skinny, Leticia, her sister. And Aunt Irma was a very burly woman. I like to joke that because of her lifelong bowling, she had like one Arnold Schwarzenegger arm. And she could destroy a whole house if she wanted to. If she didn't like the food, she would throw it. No me gusta! And everybody would scuttle to cook her something better. She didn't start out like that, but that's how. Can you imagine a life of battling her way through Mexican sports? It must have been interesting. Anyway, she loved Yul Brynner, which is why Yul Brynner's in the book, which was not a good move because the book has become, a college and high school hit, and they don't know who Yul Brynner is. So I have to explain, and they look at me. I said, he was like a shaved-headed Arnold Schwarzenegger Russian, maybe? I don't know. So she called him Yul Brynner. Yul Brynner. And the argument that's in the book actually happened in our house in Tijuana, where Aunt Irma announced out of the blue, the greatest Mexican film actor of all time is Yul Brynner. And her sister said, you're out of your mind. Yul Brynner's not Mexican. Oh, yes, it's Yul Brynner. Believe me, I have bowled all over the world, And the other one's like, what kind of a Mexican name is Yul Brynner? And Aunt Irma said, I bowled in Puerto Vallarta, and his house is in Puerto Vallarta. I saw it. Proof. And she said, and he played Pancho Villa in a movie, spoke perfect Spanish. And Letty was like, it was dubbed, you idiot. So that stuck in my mind, and I thought, this is an eccentric town, and if Aunt Irma is mayor, what's the first weird thing she would do? Yul Brynner Film Festival. And as soon as that hit, that oh my God moment, I thought, oh, it's the Magnificent Seven, because I love Steve McQueen. And the Magnificent Seven, and then the plot suddenly appeared. Oh yeah, right, it's a little town. Bad guys have come. They've got to get bad guys to fight the bad guys. Voila. And for a while, that was in my mind. And then I went to the real source, which was the Seven Samurai. And the Seven Samurai really gave me sort of the template, that and Joseph Campbell, The Hero's Journey, to tell you this story. And so Atomiko is based on Toshiro Mifune in the Seven Samurai, the unwanted Ronin, disgraced samurai, semi-drunkard, filthy, rude, always scratching his fleas. Nobody wants him around, but he still follows them, and he's occasionally the hero. He rescues everybody. Perfect for Atomiko. Now, Hugo Millán. You need to know this about Hugo Millán. A couple of things. Hugo is from a really tough family. His cousin from Tres Camarones has the coolest gangster nickname I've ever heard, and I'm going to write about this. His nickname is El Quemapueblos, which means the man who burns down cities. And he is like, you talk to him and you start shaking. The Millán family are cousins to somebody y'all probably know. Ever watch The Dog Whisperer on TV? Caesar Millan? That guy who gets every dog to do his will by saying, that guy is a Millán. He's not Caesar Millan. Cesar Millán from Culiacán, Sinaloa. And I like to say this, just so you know, regardless of what anybody says about the American dream, ponder this. Cesar Millán from Culiacán, Sinaloa, comes north, undocumented, swims across the Rio Grande, sneaks into El Paso, Texas. His only skill is talking to dogs. And now he's a multimillionaire TV idol. America. So that's their cousin, the Millán family. Hugo loved PBS. In Tijuana, in the era before cable, of course, TV everywhere, goes over the border. And he watched PBS. And on PBS, he saw Yojimbo and then the Seven Samurai. And he announced to me, Luchi, I'm going to be Mexico's first samurai warrior. And that's where the idea for Atomiko came from. He actually sort of invented some Tijuana ninja thing where he learned martial arts and he pounded gravel to make his hands hard so he could punch people. And then he got a samurai sword. And he used it for self-defense. He would, Tijuana's a rough town. He would have his samurai sword, and if people hassled him, he would chase them with the sword, like Toshiro Mifune. He was a little crazy. And so when the time came for this character, I in my mind, I saw Hugo playing him in the role. And the other character that's very popular from these books is Tacho, the young gay man. He actually, thanks to Tacho, I got this rainbow citation from the Library Association for the best book for young gay, lesbian, transgendered readers. And it meant a lot to me because you want to be careful not to create just a cartoon that a lot of people, I think, do writing about folks. But Tacho is a real guy. His name's Tacho. And he lives in Rosario. And Tacho was out in 1970 when we were kids. He's a little older than me. And if you know Chapolandia, you know that it's a very macho place with guys with cowboy boots and big belt buckles and straw hats and pistolas and huge mustaches. And Tacho was actually in some danger. And he came out because he couldn't hide it, who he was. And he was out, but ferociously out. And he got known as Tachito el Machito because he would confront you. Yeah, I'm gay, so do something about it, man. And they'd be like, oh, calm down, dude. You know, it's okay. And he carved out this niche for himself in the town. And my family didn't know what to make of me. One of the reasons my father took me down there was to try to force me to be more macho because he thought something was wrong with me. I had long hair, you know. I liked all the hippie bands. I wore love beads. He was really upset when David Bowie came around. He didn't know what to do with me. And I was completely fascinated with Tacho because I saw the heroism in that guy. But they didn't want me to be friends with him. And so I'd watch him kind of from a distance and at the movies and stuff, you know, and wanting to figure out some way to talk to him. And in 1980, I actually went to his house. My girl cousins on Christmas Eve had to go to a dance, and they wanted to buy new shoes. And I said, girls, where are you going to go on Christmas Eve? And they said, Tacho. I said, wait, Tacho sells women's shoes? And they said, it's the best place to go in the town for, you know. So do you want to go? And I said, heck yeah, I want to go. And so the way you first see him in the book is the night I first met him. He had a red bandana, and he had a beauty mark right here. And he was hilariously funny. And, you know, they introduced me, and I said, Tacho, I've been watching you since 1970. And he looked at me. He said, really? I said, yeah, man, I just love you. And he said, really? I said, well, I may not love you that way, but I do love you. And we had a really wonderful time. And a lot of the jokes that he says in the book were from just talking to him. He'd say these wild things, right? And so when time came for this character that wasn't in Seven Samurai or the movie, but I thought, you know, this is going to be the love story of Nayeli and her friends. And she needed, you know, a sort of a co-knight to go into battle, and he would go with her, thus affording me a love between people that didn't have to worry about, you know, sex and romance, just loving each other as human beings, which is important to me for the template of the story. It would be Tacho. And so when the Spanish edition came out, which is called Rumbo al Hermoso Norte, my family took Tacho, the copy in Spanish. And then there was a silence, you know. And I wrote to my cousin and I said, well, what did Tacho say? And he said, he's become insufferable, man. To this day. And he keeps the book with him. He shows it to people. Mira lo que hice aquí, you know. Which made me really happy. And the last, just to let you know, and then whatever you'd like to talk about, the character of Nayeli, the hero, you know, again, the little Joseph Campbell there. I found a whole lot of hero's journey. You don't find a whole lot of heroine's journey. Starhawk, the witch, the modern witch, she wrote a heroine's journey book. But I thought that was a shame. You know, this was an era of, you can read about Roland and Beowulf and Mad Max and King Arthur and Robin Hood, but where are these women warriors? Sarah Connor in The Terminator, maybe? You know, I don't know. Furiosa in Mad Max, I guess. So I wanted to tell that story as best I could and sort of transpose what that journey would be. So Nayeli begins as an innocent and goes through this series of classic sort of trials, you know, fight. She has to go into an alien territory on night journeys and fight forces of evil and dragons, and she has a symbolic death and goes through the underworld and is reborn and goes on this far journey to save her people. And at the end of the journey, she has what, in my opinion, is a fatal wounding. She's not actually fatal, but it's a series of betrayals she survives to realize her fate as a warrior. So, there was actually a background to all of that. But Nayeli herself, Nayeli Cervantes, is a real person. She's on Facebook. Y'all can look her up. Nayeli Cervantes. She's pregnant. She's about to have a baby. Nayeli Cervantes, long story again short, was a child of the Tijuana garbage dump. After my father died, I went to work at the Tijuana garbage dump with the poor because life had zero meaning and I wanted meaning back. And so I like to say I'm probably your first author that began his writing career washing feet of garbage pickers, but that's what I did. And Nayeli's mother was a friend of mine, so I've known Nayeli since she was born. Garbage dump child, went to school, so on and so forth. Learned the internet, was following my book tours off my blog and things. Did a This American Life episode with Nayeli and her mom. It's on their website. It's called Garbage, if you want to hear it, free. Nayeli always been this awesome person. And the reporter wanted to thank her, and we took her out to a fancy supper. And it was a seafood dinner, and Nayeli got her first lobster, her first shrimp, her first clams, maybe even crab. And what we did not know is she was allergic to sea. Yeah. And it was her and her mom, myself, the reporter, and my brother. And my brother was driving. And, they'd never been waited on. They'd never been treated that way. And so we were driving back up in the dark, up the hill to the garbage, which is depressing enough. And Nayeli went into anaphylactic shock and started choking to death. And as per the character in the book, the whole time, she kept smiling at me, sort of apologetically. And we spun around, and I was holding her with her mom in the back, and we started looking for a clinic, and we couldn't find a clinic, and we finally found this little sort of private hospital. And my brother and the reporter went running in, and at this point, Nayeli had choked, and she was ice cold and gray, and her eyes back. And her mother and I were dragging her, and she was sort of not quite walking. And we got in there, and they were fighting with the doctor on call. And the doctor wouldn't allow her in. When we came in, he said, "Ella no." And we said, "What?" And she said, "Aquí no, ella no." And we said, "Why not?" And he said, "She's an Indian. Es India. Aquí no." Now that's code language, of course, for low, untouchable, poor, dirty, whatever. Not one of us, not a fine person. And the reporter, Alan Weissman, if you're curious, he's out and about, had his reporter's vest on with all of his crap, and he pulled out a microphone. And he said to the guy, "You're going to tell the National Public Radio audience all over the United States and Mexico that you, doctor, are going to allow this child to die live and on the air because you're a racist?" And you know what those guys are all like. He immediately, when the media showed up, "Oh, no, senor, no, misunderstanding. We're not like that." She needed one shot to survive, so he reluctantly busted out an EpiPen and saved her life. And we went back up the hill when she was breathing. And I was beside myself with grief and terror. It was really terrifying. And when we got out of the vehicle and we were holding each other, she's tiny, so I was hugging her, And I said, "I almost lost you." And she said, "No, I know. And I said, "I don't know what to do." And she said, "No, yes, yes." And I had published a couple of books, but it wasn't like what things are happening now. And I said, "You know what, Nayeli, I'm going to go get famous. And when I get famous, I'm going to make you the hero of a book." And she was like, "Yeah, sure. Yeah." I said, "I'm serious. I'm going to do it. Ay, Luis, And so when the book came out, she was stunned that she was the hero of the book. And we didn't expect the NEA to pick up this book and that, thousands of people would read it. A couple of hundred people read it, and that was good. And then all of a sudden, this happened. And so people find her on Facebook. She doesn't know what to do about that. And women are having baby girls and naming them Nayeli. And they send her pictures of baby Nayeli. Then it was made into a stage play, and so it's had 4 runs over the last year. The last 2, one's in Chicago and one's in San Diego, and she's finding herself famous. And the good part of all this is that we've sold it to TNT, and it's a TV series. And to make good on my promise to her, she's getting 10% of all the money. So, let me amend that. TNT Network said, yeah, that's great. Give her 10% of your money. But Nayeli's life will never be that way again. No more suffering, we hope. And the good thing is, if it starts next year, if the series is a hit, then we have all the power. And then it'll be 10% of TNT's money. So, and that's the story. And I'm really thrilled to be here with you and talk to people. So I don't know how long we've got, but if you have any questions, hit me, and I'll try to answer you. Thanks. Yes?
Where did Matt come from?
Missionary Matt? People are always asking me, dude, are you Missionary Matt? I say, I am Atomico, man. Missionary Matt came from all the missionary boys I used to work with, They were all Southern California Baptist boys, man. Surfer boys back then, and they all talked kind of California, Everything was bitching, dude. And they would go down there in their shorts, hang 10 shorts and Varnays. And the girls, like in the book, just thought it was astounding. Because we'd go to these little villages, that never saw those kind of guys. So some of these guys were, Christian playboys, and that it was very innocent. And they would pass out their phone numbers. If you're ever in San Diego, call me up, dude, And I thought, how cool would it be if some of those folks did show up in San Diego? What would he do? And the guy that I had in mind was actually named Matt Boyer. He's not the character, but he was one of the guys I hung out with a lot. And we had a bunch of really goofy misadventures down there together. And the girls just adored him. Mateo! And unbeknownst to me, it was a weird work of prophecy in that, the guy in the book is wrestling with his faith in Christ and is token up and smoking a little bit of meth and stuff. And that's actually what ended up killing Matt. I didn't know till after the book was out, and some of our mutual friends were like, dude, you totally called it. I said, called what? Matt. I had no idea. I just pulled it out of the air because there were some Marks and some Matts, a bunch of guys with M names, and I just thought Matt was such an American name, I had no idea that was happening. And that happens oddly all through the book. The character Vumpy, the goth, I just thought it was funny because everything in the book is trying to subvert our opinions or our easy assumptions. In my mind, I was writing a book people would read on their princess cruise while sucking on a rum drink and find themselves rooting for people that they hold up signs against sometimes. I thought that would be interesting and subversive. And I thought, showing things that you don't expect down in Mexico, like goths, was kind of amusing. What I didn't know is that I have a niece who's a goth in Sinaloa. I didn't even know she existed. And I heard from her dad, who said they had had a fight about this, and the girl said, at least Tio Luis understands me. I'd never even met her. I didn't know so I felt good. I felt like, yes. But yeah, Matt was sort of a conglomeration of a lot of the I didn't know Baptists. I was raised Catholic, and oddly enough, the Mexican part of my family were semi-apostates. They weren't church people. But my mom was Episcopalian and loved Roman Catholic ritual, so I was raised Catholic. And then all of a sudden, I'm doing missionary work with a bunch of New Tribes Missions Baptists, and I had never seen that before. I'd never seen folk songs and all those girls back then they'd wear those pioneer dresses to the floor, and they had learned missionary Spanish. You know, it wasn't like real Spanish, but it was like Glory Jesus Spanish with this accent. So they'd get up there in front of the orphanage with their guitars and, Vamos a alabar a Cristo Rey, niños, en el amor de Dios. And they'd start singing, solamente en Cristo, solamente en él, woo, la salvación se encuentra en él. And all these little kids are just waiting for a donut, you know. And they're Catholic too, so they're like, what is that? And so it was a cultural readjustment to me, because I was watching another way of approaching God, which I found really innocent and funny. So that's where Matt came from. Yes?
Do you feel like there was a weight lifted off of your shoulders when you finished writing the book?
Kinda, yeah. I felt happy. You know, I felt like I had done my job as best I could. And I thought, honestly, I mean, you know, like I said, the other book took me 26 years. This took me 6 weeks, and it was so much fun. I thought, it's a minor book, you know, I understand that. And now it's become the book of record. When I die, it's going to say, Luis Urrea, author of Into the Beautiful North. And all that stuff that I sweat blood over, whatever. He had some other books, which is weird. But yeah, I felt happy. It got mixed reviews because it wasn't those other books. They were like, oh, this is not a real work of serious literature. And now, thanks to y'all reading it, they're like, this is a great work of literature. People were, I promise not to give any spoilers to people who aren't done with it yet, but some critics weren't happy with the way it ended. And one of the guys, Alan Chus, who has since passed away, said that in a review. And then he wrote me and he said, I didn't mean to say that, man. I meant to say I just wish it had gone on more. I wanted more. And I said, that's great, Alan. Thanks for costing me about 20,000 sales. That's great. And he said, well, of course, you know there have to be sequels. And I'd never thought of that. And I said, sequels? Is this going to be like my ladies' #1 detective agency books, you know? Nayeli's #1. And he said, yes, at least 3 books. And I said, okay, what's the second book? And he said, that's easy. It's the Battle of Tres Camarones. How does Nayeli get the town back? And it can't just be a bloodbath. It's got to be devious and devilish and hilarious. And I said, oh, right, a war with narcos that's hilarious. That'll be easy. And I said, and what's the third book? And he said, Tacho's wedding, man. And I thought, can't I just go to that? I want to write that. So I don't know what's going to happen with TNT. They've made me a contributing producer, which I suspect means paycheck to leave us alone. But I'm meeting with them on the 26th to talk about it. And they're very serious about this. They're very serious about doing the actual artful, intelligent, Latino-based programming that people have failed to figure out yet. No cartoons. No silly, crazy Ricky Ricardo stuff, but real stuff. And they don't know anything about the dumps and all that. So there's a slight chance I can actually have a say in it. And if they are going to go by my work, then I might be stuck, you know, like Game of Thrones, cranking out books so that they can base things on. I don't know. We'll find out. But yeah, that's it. You were first.
There's an attention to food in the books that I was wondering if it's related to your move north. Their fascination with pancakes, the differences between Mexican food in Mexico versus in America.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have anything to say with that?
Yeah, people say I write food porn. So like in Queen of America, there are actually recipes in the back. I went to chefs and they made dishes that were in the book because I was making it up. I think it's true of any sort of rural or hard scrabble life. It matters to you what you eat, and it's important, you know. And so, and food, since the book, here's my secret, The book is really, in spite of the naughty bits and bad language, about grace and about sacrament. You know, food is a communion, so it's important. Also, for some reason, the Urrea family are pancake freaks. So when you go there, you're like, what are we going to eat? Tamales? No, we're going for pancakes. I'm like, oh, that's what they love. So I just, again, you know, trying to find ways to unite us, to communicate things. And it seemed like a very basic thing. If we could have a meal together and you could sort of revel in the glories of that meal. I'll leave you with a thought. There's another NEA chosen author is Rudolfo Anaya, who's a wonderful New Mexico writer, and he wrote a book called Bless Me Ultima, which is kind of a classic, if you like folk healer stories. And when I was a kid, I met him, and he told me, if you can take your grandmother from Tijuana and make her the grandmother of a reader in Iowa, then you've committed the greatest political and religious act you can do. And so I'm always trying to do that, you know, trying to make us sit down together, forget our worries, and have a pancake.